Welcome to Insights in History, a monthly program presented by the History Museum. My name is Marilyn Thompson, and I'm the museum's marketing director. We want to thank the presenting sponsor of Insights in History, Tousley Hall Canopa, LLP. Their generous support helps make this program possible. The year 2020 marks the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment. The museum's new exhibit, Votes for Women, chronicles the national and local history of women's suffrage. Our guest speaker for today's program is one of the curators of the exhibit. Please join me in welcoming the Registrar of the History Museum, Kristi Dunn.
Hi, my name is Kristi Dunn. Welcome to 100 Years of the 19th Amendment. In my presentation, I will chronicle the 19th Amendment, which was a monumental turning point for women's suffrage. The long fought-for legal guarantee of women's right to vote was celebrated, although many continued to face barriers on the way to the polls. I will also talk about local women who have contributed to the growth of the South Bend region, making a positive difference in the community we know today.
All men are created equal. This is what I grew up hearing, being told that men meant humans, so all humans are created equal. As I grew older, I realized that this was not how history tells the tale. The lack of equality has led to the need for laws that were meant to balance everyone's right and seek that ultimate equality between men, women, and people of all races and ethnicities. The following article is proposed as an amendment to the Constitution, which shall be valid to all intents and purposes as part of the Constitution when ratified by the legislatures of 3/4 of several states. Quote, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation." Ratified August 18, 1920, this year marked the 100th anniversary of the amendment. The 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution prohibits the states and the federal government from denying the right to vote to citizens of the United States based on basis of sex. Initially introduced to Congress in 1878, several attempts to pass a women's suffrage amendment failed until passing the House of Representatives on May 21, 1919, followed by the Senate on June 4, 1919. It was then submitted to the states for ratification. Here we have a map of women's suffrage laws in states immediately before the passage of the 19th Amendment. You can see which states already had full suffrage or partial suffrage, and who had no suffrage at all. On August 18, 1920, Tennessee was the last of the necessary 36 ratifying states to secure adoption. The 19th Amendment's adoption was certified on August 26, 1920, the culmination of a decades-long movement for women's suffrage at both the state and national levels. Early on in the United States of America, states typically limited the right to vote to freeholders. Freeholders being defined as persons who owned land worth a certain amount of money. It was through that, among other things, that propertyless individuals had no stake in the community, or they might be inclined to vote for profligate spending, since they were not subject to property taxes. Still, land was cheap, and the qualification level was usually set low, so a large majority of free adult males could vote. It is easy to assume that if white men's voting rights were limited, voting rights for women and racial minorities must have been completely absent. But the truth is more complex. Most African Americans were slaves, owned by their white masters, and could not vote. Several states, however, allowed otherwise qualified, free African Americans to vote. This may seem like a step in the right direction, but it was quite the opposite. Free blacks, not including other non-whites such as Native Americans, were required to pass a test to prove competency for voting. These tests included questions that were so outlandish that there was a slim to no possibility that anyone who was not actually in the government could pass. Meaning that if you could not pass this test that was made to be impassable, you could not vote. Some of the questions that were on these exams were things like, name 3 methods of cheating at the polls. Explain in your own words the 1958 Act of the Louisiana Legislature. Who conducts registration? And what officials compose the State Board of Registration? Give their names and titles. I know this says 1958, but this sort of thing was going on since the 1800s. As is well known, most women couldn't vote, but in a significant number of locations, otherwise qualified women voted in local elections and town meetings. New Jersey was perhaps the most interesting case for women. The 1776 New Jersey Constitution provided that all inhabitants of legal age who met the property and residency requirements were entitled to vote. It is unclear whether this was originally intended to include women, but a 1790 state election law used the phrase he or she, thus clarifying the law. But alas, New Jersey's early experiment with women's suffrage did not last. After a few hotly contested elections in which rampant voter fraud was alleged, there were calls to tighten voter qualifications. In 1807, amid allegations that men dressed as women had been going to the polls to cast a second ballot, the right of women to vote in New Jersey was withdrawn. If there was much opposition to this act of disenfranchisement, history has failed to record it. Over the course of the next few decades, property qualifications for men were gradually eliminated, with the notable exception of Rhode Island, which did not eliminate property qualifications for foreign-born citizens until 1888. The country as a whole was on the path towards universal manhood suffrage. In contrast, women's suffrage was rarely taken seriously. An exception was Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who, at the historic Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, sought to propose a resolution stating, "Resolved that it is the duty of the women of this country to secure to themselves their sacred right to the elective franchise." Elizabeth Cady Stanton was born November 12, 1815, and passed away October 26, 1902. She was a leader of the women's rights movement in the U.S. during the mid to late 1800s. She was the main force behind the 1848 Seneca Falls Convention, the first convention to be called for the sole purpose of discussing women's rights, and was the primary author of its Declaration of Sentiments. Her demand for women's right to vote generated a controversy at the convention, but quickly became a central tenet of the women's movement. She was also very active in other social reform activities, especially abolitionism. Here we have a quote from her that says, "The Bible and the Church have been the greatest stumbling blocks in the way of women's emancipation." Though the word suffragist conjures the image of a 1910s woman dressed in white and holding a picket sign, Suffragists all over the United States organized for a century before the amendment was passed. During the 19th century, polling places were warehouses, stables, and saloons, places where respectable women would not have been seen. Anti-suffrage activists believed they were a silent majority, advocating that most women did not want to vote. Those fighting for the rights of women were ridiculed and often met with violence. The suffragists persisted. They protested, picketed, lobbied, and organized parades and pageants. They endured arrests and hunger strikes in addition to public humiliation and violence. Editorial cartoons poked harmful fun at suffragists and the movement, rousing national anxieties about gender roles in the United States. Faced with a stream of criticism from those who felt they were abandoning the household, women had to provide constant assurance that they would not ask for too much, being careful to still appear feminine and not to suggest that they were leaving their perceived roles as wives, mothers, and caretakers. Annie Bell Boss, seen here, was born Annie Bell Rittle in Elkhart, Indiana in 1875. The daughter of a butcher and wife of an engineer, she organized the Elkhart YWCA and served as its president, among other pursuits. Active in the Elkhart branch of the Women's Franchise League and its successor, the Indiana League of Women Voters, she also helped organize other chapters in northern Indiana and held many offices in the league. She was a well-known area suffragist, giving speeches and traveling to support the cause. Boss passed on her passion to her daughter, Helen K. Boss. Annie Bell Boss died in 1946 and is buried alongside her husband in Elkhart's Grace Lawn Cemetery. Emily Barrett Malloy, called Emma, was born in South Bend, Indiana on July 17, 1839. She lived a life as active as any modern woman. Thrice married, mother, newspaper journalist, temperance and suffrage activist, and public speaker. She was also the first female newspaper editor in northern Indiana, working for South Bend's National Union and the Elkhart Observer, among others. She had an interest in history, becoming the secretary and librarian of the newly formed St. Joseph County Historical Society, today doing business as the History Museum. Emma used her influence to hire women to be typesetters, encourage them to advance on their own and not wait for men to open the doors to the professional world. She wrote editorials that strongly promoted women's rights, including the right to vote. In 1875, she was elected one of 8 vice presidents of the Women's Suffrage Association of Indiana. She began touring as a lecturer, developing an international reputation for her rousing public speeches on suffrage and temperance, 2 entwined topics of the late 1800s. She was known for her smooth speaking style, using logic, humor, and inspiration to sway her public. Emma also worked with the indigenous Cherokee people in Oklahoma in the 1880s, moving there for several weeks after her second divorce. She was called to religious service late in life and passed away from pneumonia in 1907 while evangelizing on tour in Nevada and California. In this photo, we see Alice Mannering center with her family. Her great-granddaughter, Jean Watson, is at the bottom right and loaned us this photo for use. Alice Mannering was the first woman to run for public office in the state of Indiana as the socialist candidate in South Bend's mayoral election of 1917. At the time, she was serving as the president of the St. Joseph County branch of equal suffrage. In May 1917, Mannering wrote Henry A. Barnhart, U.S. Representative from Indiana, with regards to rising food costs. Quote, "The suffrage ladies, representing a great majority of the women voters of this city, wish to enter a protest against the exorbitant prices of food products caused by the stock jobbing and the speculation of the over-enthusiastic profit makers." The retort suggests that Mannering and other suffrage ladies should begin at once the advocacy of economy and efficiency in saving food by eliminating wasteful methods of cooking and serving. Despite such responses, Alice Mannering never gave up fighting for lower costs, equal pay, and equal voting rights. Mannering's great-granddaughter, Jean Watson of Niles, Michigan, remembers visiting with her great-grandmother as a young child. Jean framed her family as a very matriarchal family. Quote, "I knew both my great-grandmothers were very independent women." This independence was passed down to Jean as well. Jean's mother was an activist against urban renewal, and Jean attended sit-ins with civil rights activists. She never takes her vote for granted today, saying, "I wouldn't not vote if they had to take me there on a gurney." Jean would like Alice to be remembered as an activist who was born at the wrong time. Here we have a photo on loan from Ruthmere Museum in Elkhart, Indiana, of Helen Brown Beardsley. She was from Elkhart, Indiana, and founded the Elkhart chapter of the Women's Franchise League of Indiana in April 1913. In 1920, she became the first president of the Indiana League of Women Voters. During her time as president, 1920 to 1922, the state headquarters were in Elkhart, moving to Indianapolis in 1923. Helen's husband, Andrew Hubble Beardsley, was an influential businessman in Elkhart who later became a state legislator. His platform included women's suffrage, making him in large part responsible for the passage of suffrage legislation in Indiana. Mr. Beardsley's passion for the topic can be attributed to Mrs. Beardsley's knowledge and actions. Helen was known as a powerful speaker and influencer. Her rally cry to get other women to commit was, quote, "Urge women in your city to apply and work for these positions and have your leagues assist in every possible way." In 1916, Terre Haute socialist Mabel Curry made a speech from Helen's car. Quote, "The women are not anxious to get into politics to dodge home responsibilities. They wish to enter politics because they love their homes and children better than anything else in the world and wish the right to protect them. When a door sags in my home, I ask my husband to fix it. He gets his plane and does it. That's his job. But I always have to follow him with a broom and dustpan. It is the same way in politics. Women must follow men with the broom and dustpan of suffrage." This photo is on loan from Jamie Wagman and depicts the Elkhart League of Women Voters. Elkhart was home to the first state-level office for the League of Women Voters and had an active chapter with 125 members. Like most chapters, the needs of women and children were supremely important. One of the first major projects undertaken by the Elkhart League was establishment of a child welfare department. They worked to create a center where women could bring their children for medical checkups and also hear lectures on nutrition and health. By 1924, the Child Welfare Service had a staff of 3 doctors, a supervisor, a staff nurse, and nutrition worker. While women struggled for the right to vote alongside men, there was inequality amongst those fighting for equality. Native Americans, African Americans, and Chinese immigrants are among the many who still could not vote. Ida B. Wells, seen here, was one of the top names among suffragists, but was a name often spoken in hushed tones because she was black. This photo is from March 1913, from the Chicago Tribune. When over 5,000 women marched on Washington, D.C., Wells was told to join the African American suffragists at the back of the group. Well, she had other plans. She waited in the crowd until the procession began and joined the front of the delegation to be near her home state of Illinois. Though the 19th Amendment ensured that voting would not be prevented on the basis of sex, in much of the country this victory only applied to white women. The Indiana Press bulletins in the early 1920s talked about the menace of foreigners and the enemy alien. This language was used to argue that if immigrant men were able to vote, surely women should be able to as well. To hold up and justify their own rights, some suffragists held down the rights of others. One of these women was Carrie Chapman Catt, who founded the National League of Women Voters, lobbied Southern senators by famously claiming, quote, "White supremacy will be strengthened, not weakened, by women's suffrage," end quote. Indeed, the suffrage movement of the early 1900s failed to work for the rights of all women. African Americans and other minorities were still frequently and deliberately prevented from voting through poll taxes, grandfather clauses, intimidation, and violence, especially in the South. These were made illegal by the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which prohibited states from excluding minorities from voting. Many minority women fought for suffrage just as hard, if not harder, than white women. Fannie Lou Hamer, seen here, is speaking at the 1964 Democratic National Convention. Hamer was an American voting and women's rights activist, community organizer, and a leader in the civil rights movement. She was the co-founder and vice chair of the Freedom Democratic Party, which she represented at the 1964 Democratic National Convention. Hamer also organized Mississippi's Freedom Summer, along with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. She was also a co-founder of the National Women's Political Caucus, an organization created to recruit, train, and support women of all races who wish to seek election to government office. Fannie Lou Hamer suffered harassment, beatings, and jail time in the early 1960s while attempting to register to vote. Another notable African American suffragette was Anna Julia Cooper. Cooper argued for the importance of black women's rights central to education, self-determination, and racial uplift. Born a slave, Cooper lived to be 105. She became the fourth African American woman to earn a doctoral degree, earning a PhD in history from the University of Paris-Sorbonne. Cooper rose to prominence as a member of the black community in Washington, D.C., where she served as principal at M Street High School. During this time, she wrote a book called A Voice from the South. In it, she engages a variety of issues ranging from women's rights to racial progress, from segregation to literary criticism. So many women. So much fighting, such endurance. What was the conclusion? In 1918, President Wilson faced a difficult midterm election and would have to confront the issue of women's suffrage directly. 15 states had extended equal voting rights to women, and by this time, the president fully supported the federal amendment. A proposal brought before the House in January 1918 passed by only one vote. The vote was then carried into the Senate, where Wilson made an appeal on the Senate floor, an unprecedented action at the time. In a short speech, the president tied women's right to vote directly to the war, asking, quote, "Shall we admit them only to partnership of suffering and sacrifice and toil, and not to a partnership of privilege and right?" On September 30th, 1918, the proposal fell 2 votes short of passage, prompting the NWP to direct campaigning against senators who had voted against the amendment. It is arguable which state was considered the first to ratify the amendment. While Illinois legislature passed the legislation an hour prior to Wisconsin, Wisconsin's delegate, David James, arrived earlier and was presented with a statement establishing Wisconsin as the first to ratify. By August 2nd, 14 states had approved ratification, and by the end of 1919, 22 had ratified the amendment. Finally, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was enacted. It is a landmark piece of federal legislation in the United States that prohibits racial discrimination in voting. It was signed into law by President Lyndon B. Johnson during the height of the Civil Rights Movement on August 6, 1965, and Congress later amended the Act 5 times to expand its protections. Designed to enforce the voting rights guaranteed by the 14th and 15th Amendments to the United States Constitution, the Act secured the right to vote for racial minorities throughout the country, especially in the South. According to the U.S. Department of Justice, the Act is considered to be the most effective piece of federal civil rights legislation ever enacted in the country. While we still have a long way to go in the fight for equality, it can't be denied the strides that we have made and how far we have already come. Since you are unable to visit us today, here are some sneak peeks of the exhibit to get you excited for your next visit. In this exhibit, you will have the opportunity to see clothes that were worn by women at the time of the movements in the 19-teens, 1920s, and the 1960s. You'll also have the chance to see items that personally belong to some of the women who fought for change in the South Bend region. You will be able to see copies of the South Bend Tribune documenting the ratification of the amendment as well as different occurrences during the time of suffrage. And finally, you will be able to see pins and buttons that were worn during the movement and the marches, as well as some more modern commemorative pieces, including buttons and a children's book about the 1965 Civil Rights Voting Act.
Thank you for joining me today. This presentation has been a part of our Insights in History series, a monthly program at the History Museum. See you next time.